Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Sports. In this video, we will explore the forgotten and often peculiar sports of the 19th century, a time when competitions could be both curious and surprisingly intense. This narration is intentionally slow, detailed, and repetitive. It is designed to help you relax, focus, or fall asleep. There will be no sudden sounds, no music, and no emotional tone. Only the steady voice of information, carefully guiding you through each sport and its story. Now, please sit back, close your eyes if you like, and let the tale of forgotten 19th century sports begin. The 19th century was a period of immense change in nearly every aspect of human society and culture, and sports were no exception to this transformation. During this time, industrialization was reshaping cities and rural areas alike. Transportation networks were expanding at a rapid pace, and communication was becoming faster and more efficient than ever before. These changes had a profound impact on leisure and recreation, as people found themselves with more opportunities for organized play, competitive activity, and public entertainment. It was also a century in which sports began to emerge as a distinct part of popular culture. Yet the landscape of athletic pursuits was very different from the one we know today. Some of the sports that thrived in the 19th century are still familiar to us, having evolved into the modern games we watch and play, while others have vanished almost entirely from public memory, surviving only in dusty records, faded illustrations, and the occasional historical reenactment. These forgotten sports were diverse in their nature, ranging from physically demanding contests to eccentric pastimes that seem almost unbelievable by modern standards. Some were rooted in local traditions that had been passed down for generations, while others were experimental inventions of the time, fueled by the Victorian era's fascination with novelty and spectacle. Understanding these sports requires looking beyond the rules and mechanics, and instead seeing them in their social, cultural, and historical contexts. In an age before mass media as we know it, many sports were deeply tied to the communities that played them, reflecting local customs, class distinctions, and the availability of resources. In some places, rural games flourished, drawing crowds from nearby villages for seasonal events that were as much about socializing as they were about competition. In other settings, urban clubs and societies promoted new kinds of physical activity, sometimes as a way to encourage discipline and morality among the growing middle class. The 19th century was also a time of experimentation, when organizers were unafraid to try unusual ideas in pursuit of excitement and entertainment. This willingness to explore new concepts led to the creation of sports that combined elements of different games, used unorthodox equipment, or challenged participants in unexpected ways. Some of these ideas took hold and spread widely, eventually shaping the sports we recognize today, while others remained regional oddities, fading away when interest waned or when other activities proved more appealing. The forgotten sports of this era also remind us that the line between athletic competition and public spectacle was often blurred. Matches were sometimes accompanied by music, parades, or theatrical performances, and wagers were a common element, adding an extra layer of excitement and risk. Spectators often attended not only to watch the athletes, but also to be part of the event's social atmosphere, where food, drink, and conversation flowed freely. In studying these sports, we gain insight into the values and priorities of 19th century society. We see how people used games to express identity, reinforce traditions, and adapt to changing circumstances. We also see how innovation was not always about creating something entirely new, but sometimes about reimagining old practices in ways that fit the moment. The rise and fall of these sports can often be traced to broader historical forces, such as urbanization, technological progress, shifting moral attitudes, and the growing influence of international competition. Some games faded simply because they required too much space in increasingly crowded cities, while others disappeared because they were deemed too dangerous or unruly. The growth of organized sport governing bodies in the late 19th century also played a role, as standardized rules and formal competitions favored certain games over others, leading to the marginalization of less conventional pastimes. Yet the memory of these sports continues to offer lessons for us today. They remind us that athletic activity has always been a dynamic part of human culture, capable of adapting to new circumstances and reflecting the unique character of its time. They challenge us to think about what makes a sport endure and why some games capture the collective imagination while others fade away. In exploring the forgotten sports of the 19th century, we also connect with the creativity, energy, and sometimes sheer eccentricity of the people who played them. Their stories are a reminder that sport is not just about competition or physical skill, but also about community, identity, and the joy of shared experience. As we journey through this topic, we will look at a variety of games, each with its own origins, rules, and cultural significance. Some will seem familiar in structure, but strange in detail, while others may be so unusual that they feel entirely alien. In each case, we will try to reconstruct not only how the sport was played, but also why it mattered to the people who played it. By doing so, we can appreciate the rich and varied landscape of 19th century recreation, and perhaps find inspiration in its forgotten corners. The story of these sports is ultimately a story about change, about how human beings create, adapt, and sometimes abandon the ways they choose to play. It is also a story about memory and how easily parts of our cultural heritage can slip from view if they are not actively preserved. In this way, examining the forgotten sports of the 19th century is not only an act of historical curiosity, but also a way of keeping alive a part of our shared past, ensuring that these games and the people who loved them are not entirely lost to time. The 19th century was a time when society was undergoing profound changes in structure, values, and daily life. And these shifts deeply influenced the kinds of sports that were played, how they were organized, and who had access to them. Industrialization was rapidly transforming economies, drawing millions from rural areas into urban centers where factories, workshops, and new industries dominated the landscape. This migration brought together people from different backgrounds, creating communities that were often diverse in origin, but united by shared work schedules, limited leisure time, and a growing desire for recreation. The working classes, in particular, developed their own sporting traditions, many of which were shaped by the physical demands of their occupations and the rhythms of the industrial work week. Sundays and public holidays often became the only times available for organized play, and sports in these settings were as much about socializing and building community bonds as they were about competition or skill. In rural areas, the influence of long-standing traditions was still strong, and many games that dated back centuries continued to be played. often tied to seasonal festivals or local celebrations. These sports could involve entire villages, with large open fields or commons serving as the arena for events that combined athleticism, ritual, and festivity. Agricultural communities often had the space and the communal spirit to sustain games that might be impractical in crowded cities, and the rules were sometimes flexible or even unwritten, passed down orally from one generation to the next. The middle and upper classes approached sport differently, often viewing it as a means of promoting discipline, moral character, and physical fitness, in line with prevailing ideas about self-improvement and societal order. Many private clubs, schools, and universities developed their own formalized sports, codifying rules and introducing structured competition. This was a period when amateurism was highly valued among the elites, with a strong belief that true sportsmanship meant playing for the love of the game rather than for financial reward. Such ideals influenced which sports gained prominence and which were marginalized, especially as national and regional governing bodies began to emerge in the latter half of the century. Class divisions also shaped access to resources and facilities. The wealthy could afford purpose-built grounds, specialized equipment, and time for regular practice, while the working classes often had to make do with improvised spaces and homemade gear. These disparities meant that some sports naturally became associated with particular social groups. For example, fox hunting and certain forms of rowing remained largely elite activities, while rougher, less formalized games thrived in working-class neighborhoods. However, there were also points of overlap where people from different classes might come together, particularly in towns where public fairs and festivals provided occasions for all to participate in or watch a variety of games. Gender roles in the 19th century also had a significant impact on sport. While women did participate in recreational activities, societal expectations often limited their involvement to sports considered appropriately modest and non-competitive. Archery, lawn tennis in its early form, and croquet were among the few games that women of the middle and upper classes were encouraged to play, often within the controlled settings of gardens or private clubs. In rural settings, women sometimes took part in local festivities that included games, but such participation was often framed in a way that reinforced traditional gender norms. It was rare for women to have the same opportunities for training, competition, or public recognition as men, which in turn affected the development of women's sports for decades to come. Another crucial factor in the social context of 19th century sports was the influence of nationalism and regional identity. As countries across Europe and beyond were defining or redefining their national identities, sport became a way to express cultural pride and unity. Some games were celebrated as distinctly local traditions, while others were promoted as national pastimes, sometimes as part of broader political or cultural agendas. The spread of the British Empire, for example, helped export British sports to distant parts of the world, where they often mingled with local customs to produce unique hybrids. At the same time, immigrant communities brought their own games with them to new lands, creating cultural exchanges that enriched the sporting landscape. The technological advancements of the era also played a role in shaping the culture of sport. The expansion of railways made it possible for teams and spectators to travel to matches in other towns or cities, fostering inter-regional competitions that would have been impractical in earlier times. The growing newspaper industry provided coverage of major events, turning local champions into minor celebrities and spreading knowledge of different games to new audiences. Equipment manufacturing also began to benefit from industrial processes, making standardized balls, bats, and other gear more widely available, though still not affordable for all. Leisure time was becoming a more defined part of life, particularly for the middle classes, and sports began to occupy a central role in how that time was spent. While some viewed certain games as frivolous or even morally suspect, others championed them as a means of promoting health, discipline, and social cohesion. This tension between viewing sport as entertainment and viewing it as moral improvement would continue to shape attitudes throughout the century. Importantly, the cultural context of the 19th century was not static, as political reforms, labour movements, and changing social attitudes reshaped daily life. The types of sports people played and the ways they organised them evolved in response. Some forgotten sports of this era faded because they no longer fit the emerging cultural landscape, while others disappeared simply because newer, more standardized games gained popularity. The social and cultural environment of the 19th century thus provided both the fertile ground for the creation of diverse sporting traditions and the conditions that led to their eventual decline. Understanding this context is essential for appreciating why certain games thrived, why others were lost, and how the era's values and circumstances continue to influence the sports we know today. The Industrial Revolution was one of the most significant forces shaping the development, popularity, and eventual decline of many sports in the 19th century, and its influence can be seen in almost every aspect of leisure and recreation during that period. Industrialization brought dramatic changes to the way people lived and worked, restructuring daily routines, altering social hierarchies, and concentrating large populations into rapidly growing urban centres. This transformation created both opportunities and challenges for sports, with some games flourishing in the new environment, while others struggled to adapt and eventually disappeared. Before industrialization, many sports were rooted in agricultural rhythms, tied to seasonal cycles, local festivals, and traditional customs. Games like mob football, village wrestling contests, and various forms of folk races thrived in open fields and communal spaces, often involving large numbers of participants with minimal formal organization. These games fit naturally into a slower-paced, community-centered lifestyle, where time was measured by the harvest and social life revolved around the village square. However, as industrial work replaced agricultural labor for millions of people, the time available for such sprawling events diminished. Factory work was rigidly scheduled, with long hours and few breaks, and this new structure left workers with limited windows for leisure activities. Urban living further complicated matters. The densely packed streets, lack of open fields, and general overcrowding in industrial cities made it difficult to maintain the same kinds of sports that had thrived in rural areas. Large-scale, chaotic games were often impossible to stage in these settings, and local authorities sometimes discouraged or outright banned them, citing concerns about public order, property damage, and injury. In their place, more compact and organised sports began to emerge. Games that could be played within enclosed grounds, followed standardised rules, and fit into the shorter periods of leisure that industrial workers could afford. Another key aspect of industrialization's impact on sports was the increasing emphasis on discipline, order, and efficiency. The industrial workplace demanded punctuality, obedience, and adherence to rules, and these values began to spill over into the leisure sphere. Sports that could be codified and controlled found favor among both employers and civic leaders, who saw organized games as a way to promote moral behavior, physical fitness, and social harmony. This shift toward regulation helped standardize sports like association football, cricket, and athletics, but it also marginalized older games that relied on spontaneous participation and flexible rules. The spread of the railway system transformed sports by making travel faster and more accessible. Teams from different towns could now compete against one another without days of journeying, leading to the creation of regional leagues and intercity tournaments. Spectators could also travel to watch matches, turning sport into a more public spectacle and fostering the growth of dedicated fan communities. However, this new infrastructure also created a competitive environment in which only sports with enough organizational structure to schedule and market matches could thrive. Many smaller, localized games could not compete with the appeal and visibility of the sports that benefited from railway connections, printed schedules, and newspaper coverage. Industrialization also influenced the physical spaces in which sports were played. The growing middle class, benefiting from economic expansion, funded the construction of purpose-built sports facilities, such as cricket grounds, tennis courts, and gymnasiums. These venues provided a controlled environment where rules could be enforced, fees collected, and spectators accommodated. For many forgotten sports of the 19th century, the absence of such facilities meant they remained tied to informal settings, which became increasingly scarce in industrial cities. Without the infrastructure to support them, these games slowly vanished from public life. The economic changes of the industrial era further shaped the divide between amateur and professional sport. In many cases, working-class athletes sought to earn money from their skills, whether through prize matches, betting, or public exhibitions. The middle and upper classes, however, often resisted the idea of professionalism, seeing it as contrary to the ideals of pure competition and amateur virtue. This clash of values led to the exclusion of some sports from official recognition, particularly those associated with gambling or physical roughness, and helped cement the social divides that defined 19th century sporting culture. Industrial manufacturing also influenced the equipment used in sport. The mass production of balls, bats, rackets, and protective gear made it easier for standardized games to spread, but it also required players to adapt to uniform rules and measurements. Sports that traditionally relied on locally made or improvised equipment often faded when faced with the dominance of factory-produced gear designed for codified games. Even clothing was affected, as industrial textile production made uniforms more common, reinforcing the idea of organized teams and formal competition. Another crucial change brought by industrialization was the emergence of leisure as a distinct and valued part of life, particularly for the middle classes. The idea that recreation could contribute to health, moral improvement, and even productivity at work gained traction, and sports became a central component of this new leisure culture. Governments and employers sometimes encouraged certain sports as a way to occupy workers during their free time, reducing the risk of social unrest. However, this support was usually directed toward regulated, spectator-friendly games, rather than the unstructured, traditional sports that had once flourished in villages and small towns. Industrialization also helped spread sports internationally. The movement of goods, people, and ideas across railways, steamships, and telegraph lines allowed games developed or codified in one country to quickly appear in another. British sports, in particular, travelled widely through trade networks and colonial expansion, often replacing or overshadowing local games. This process contributed to the decline of many indigenous sports, which were either adapted to fit new international standards or abandoned altogether. The legacy of industrialization in the sporting world is therefore one of both creation and loss. It provided the tools, structures, and networks that allowed certain sports to flourish, becoming global phenomena that endure today. At the same time, it imposed new constraints on space, time, and culture that caused countless traditional games to disappear. Understanding the role of industrialization is essential to understanding why some 19th century sports are remembered and celebrated, while others exist only in old photographs, newspaper clippings, or fading oral histories. Throughout the 19th century, sports were not uniform in form or meaning, but deeply shaped by the cultural traditions, geographic landscapes, and regional identities of the communities that played them. While the rise of industrialization and the spread of standardized rules began to unify certain popular sports, many games of the era remained tied to local customs, dialects, and unique historical contexts, which gave them a distinct identity, but also made them vulnerable to disappearance as national and international standards took hold. In rural areas, particularly those isolated from major urban centres, sports often reflected centuries-old traditions passed down through festivals, fairs, and seasonal gatherings. These games were less about rigid competition and more about reinforcing community bonds, marking the change of seasons, or honouring historical events. In parts of England, for example, regional variants of football could differ so dramatically that players from neighbouring villages could barely agree on the rules, with one town allowing handling of the ball while another prohibited it entirely. These variations persisted because they were deeply embedded in the local identity and because travel between regions was limited, allowing traditions to evolve independently. Geography also played a decisive role in shaping regional sports. Coastal communities developed games that revolved around fishing culture, boat handling, and maritime navigation, sometimes turning practical skills into competitive displays. Mountainous areas favoured endurance contests and strength-based games tied to agricultural work, such as stone lifting, timber carrying, or hill sprints. In snowy regions, proto-versions of skiing and ice-based games thrived long before they entered the modern sporting canon. These physical environments dictated not only the types of sports played, but also the equipment, playing surfaces, and seasonal timing, giving each region a distinctive sporting calendar. Cultural influences were equally significant in determining which sports flourished. In areas with strong oral storytelling traditions, sports often doubled as opportunities to share local legends and reinforce cultural heritage. The rules, chants, and ceremonial aspects of these games were infused with symbolic meaning, and to participate was to reaffirm a shared identity. In some communities, sporting events were accompanied by music, dance, or religious rituals, blurring the lines between sport, art, and spiritual practice. This cultural richness made such games deeply meaningful to their participants, but it also made them difficult to adapt to the impersonal, rule-bound structures that emerged during the late 19th century. The role of regional dialects and languages in preserving sports should not be underestimated. Many games had names, terminology, and scoring systems that were inseparable from the local language. When national newspapers, sporting bodies, and educational institutions promoted standardized rules in the dominant language, local games often lost visibility. Without written records in their original form, some sports were remembered only by older generations, and when those generations passed away, the games faded from living memory. Migration patterns in the 19th century also influenced the survival or transformation of regional sports. Workers moving from rural areas to industrial cities sometimes tried to recreate their traditional games in cramped urban settings, adapting them to fit smaller spaces and shorter schedules. However, these adaptations often diluted the original format, and over time, the games merged with or were replaced by more widely recognized sports that had better facilities and organizational support. Conversely, in immigrant communities, traditional games from the homeland were kept alive as a way to maintain cultural identity, though these too often faced pressure to conform to the dominant sporting culture of the host country. The spread of education systems in the late 19th century played a double role in shaping regional sports. On one hand, schools could introduce children to local games and ensure their survival. On the other, many school curricula prioritized nationally recognized sports, sidelining regional variations. This was especially true in countries where sport was seen as a tool for instilling discipline, unity, and patriotism, leading to an emphasis on sports like cricket, rugby, or gymnastics at the expense of smaller, localized traditions. Another major factor in the decline of regional sports was the rise of print media. Newspapers and illustrated periodicals began covering sporting events in unprecedented detail, but their focus was naturally on games that attracted the largest crowds and had the most standardized rules. This media attention not only boosted the popularity of certain sports, but also created a feedback loop in which sponsors, facility builders, and promoters invested in those games, further marginalizing the less publicized regional ones. In some cases, regional sports did survive by aligning themselves with broader cultural movements. For example, in areas with strong nationalist sentiment, traditional sports were rebranded as symbols of cultural pride and resistance to outside influence. These revived games were sometimes showcased at festivals or exhibitions to emphasize their heritage value, though the versions presented were often modified for public display rather than played in their original, community-based form. Even so, this cultural revivalism preserved at least some elements of the games that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The diversity of 19th century sports is a testament to the human capacity to adapt play to any environment and to imbue it with meaning that reflects local values and conditions. Yet it is precisely this diversity that made many games fragile in the face of the homogenizing forces of industrialization, urbanization, and national identity building. While some regional sports found ways to evolve or merge with larger traditions, others could not survive the loss of their specific cultural context. Today, the memory of these forgotten games offers a glimpse into the social fabric of the 19th century, revealing how sport functioned as both a mirror of daily life and a vessel of community identity. The regional variations that once made these sports vibrant now serve as a reminder that games are never just games. They are living expressions of the people and places that create them. The arrival of industrialization in the 19th century profoundly altered the rhythms of daily life, the structure of communities, and the opportunities people had for leisure, creating a cascade of changes that directly influenced the survival of many traditional sports. Before industrialization, much of the population lived in rural settings where seasonal cycles of work left pockets of free time for festivals, fairs, and community gatherings in which sports played a central role. Games were often tied to agricultural calendars, celebrated after harvests, or held during religious holidays when the entire community could participate. With industrialization, however, large numbers of people moved to rapidly growing cities to work in factories, mills, and mines. The rigid demands of industrial labor, with long working hours and minimal days off, left little time for extended communal games that might have once lasted for an entire day or even several days. The spaces available for sport also shifted dramatically during this period. In rural areas, large open fields, village greens, and common lands had provided natural venues for games, often with no need for formal boundaries or purpose-built facilities. In urban environments, such expanses of open space were scarce, and those that existed were increasingly privatized or developed for housing, factories, and transport infrastructure. As a result, traditional sports that required wide playing areas, such as certain forms of mob football or large-scale team chases, became difficult or impossible to organize. Industrialization also changed the demographics and social structures of communities, which disrupted the intergenerational transmission of sporting traditions. In the past, young people would learn games directly from older generations within the same village or town. But in industrial cities, neighborhoods were often composed of people from many different regions and backgrounds. This mixing diluted the presence of any single local sport and encouraged the adoption of games that could be understood and played by people regardless of their origin. Sports that had standardized rules and clear structures, like cricket or association football, were more likely to gain traction in these diverse environments because they offered a common framework for play. Another significant factor was the growing influence of formalized sports clubs and governing bodies, many of which emerged in industrial centers. These organizations often promoted specific sports that they deemed suitable for structured competition, moral improvement, and public entertainment. Their chosen sports benefited from resources such as dedicated playing grounds, uniforms, and regular fixtures, making them more appealing to new urban populations. In contrast, many traditional sports lacked official representation, and without institutional support, they gradually disappeared from public life. Industrialization also played a role in reshaping the nature of leisure time itself. In pre-industrial rural communities, leisure and work often blended, with sports occurring in the midst of communal labor or as part of seasonal duties. In industrial cities, leisure became a distinct, limited portion of life, often confined to evenings or Sundays. This separation encouraged the growth of sports that could be played in shorter, more organized formats, replacing older games that unfolded at a slower pace and allowed for extended breaks. The economic realities of industrialization further influenced the survival of sports. As wages rose for some workers, people gained disposable income to spend on recreation, but they were also increasingly drawn to spectator sports that required little physical participation. Professional competitions, supported by ticket sales and media coverage, grew rapidly in popularity. Watching a football match or a boxing bout in a stadium or arena was more convenient than travelling to a countryside field to participate in a traditional sport. The growth of railways amplified this trend by making it easier for spectators to travel to organised matches and for professional teams to tour. Railways also facilitated the spread of standardised rules, as teams from different regions could meet more frequently and agree on consistent regulations. This standardisation, while beneficial for the sports that embraced it, marginalised traditional games that were difficult to codify or resisted alteration to fit formal competition structures. Industrialisation even influenced the types of equipment used in sports. Mass production made it possible to manufacture standardised balls, bats, nets, and uniforms at relatively low cost, reinforcing the dominance of sports that could take advantage of these products. Traditional sports that relied on locally crafted or improvised equipment struggled to adapt, especially when their gear required specialised knowledge that was disappearing along with the craftspeople who made it. The cultural values promoted during the industrial era also affected sport. Employers, educators, and social reformers often supported sports that were seen as disciplined, orderly, and morally uplifting, which meant that chaotic or rough traditional games were sometimes actively discouraged or banned. Concerns about public disorder, property damage, and worker fatigue led authorities to regulate or prohibit certain traditional sports, especially those that involved large crowds moving through public streets or physically intense contests with minimal safety precautions. While industrialization accelerated the decline of many traditional sports, it also created the conditions for new sports to emerge and flourish. Some old games were adapted to fit the urban environment, given new rules, or combined with elements from other sports to create hybrid forms that better suited the constraints of industrial life. Others survived only in rural pockets, far from the industrial centres, where local traditions remained strong enough to resist change. The overall impact of industrialisation on 19th century sports was therefore complex, involving both loss and transformation. The disappearance of many traditional games was not simply the result of disinterest, but the consequence of a fundamental restructuring of society. As work schedules became more regimented, communities more fragmented, and leisure more commercialized, the fabric that had once supported these sports unraveled. Yet, the memory of these forgotten games still offers insight into how people adapted their recreational lives in response to massive economic and social change, and it highlights the resilience of human play in even the most challenging circumstances. In the 19th century, the development of transportation and communication systems reshaped almost every aspect of society, and the world of sports was no exception. Before the arrival of railways, telegraphs, and improved road networks, many sports remained regional pastimes, known only within a small geographic area. Players and spectators were often limited to what could be reached by foot, horseback, or slow-moving carriage. This meant that a sport might thrive in one town or county, but be entirely unknown just a few hundred miles away. As the century progressed, however, the expansion of rail travel created entirely new opportunities for sporting events to spread beyond their local origins. Railways allowed both participants and audiences to travel much greater distances in shorter periods of time. A player who once competed solely within their village could now join matches in distant cities. Spectators could follow teams and tournaments with a regularity that had been impossible in earlier decades. This not only increased the visibility of existing sports, but also introduced regional games to new communities, allowing some of them to gain national or even international followings. The telegraph, another transformative innovation of the era, played a critical role in this expansion as well. Before the telegraph, news of a competition's outcome might take days or weeks to reach the next town, by which time the excitement had long since faded. With instant communication across long distances, results could be reported within minutes of a match ending. Newspapers eagerly adopted telegraph technology to relay sports news quickly, meaning that fans who could not attend an event in person could still feel connected to it. This sense of immediacy helped build a shared sporting culture among people separated by hundreds of miles. Faster communication also allowed for more organized scheduling of competitions. Teams could coordinate matches with far-off opponents and arrange tournaments that brought together players from various regions. This interconnection encouraged the standardization of rules, as competing teams needed to agree on a common framework before they could meet on the field. Sports that had once been played under a variety of local customs began to converge toward uniform regulations, laying the foundation for modern codification. Another important aspect of transportation improvements was the accessibility of venues. Large stadiums and arenas could be built in central locations, confident that spectators from multiple towns could travel to attend. This, in turn, led to the commercialization of sport, as ticket sales, concessions, and printed programs became profitable ventures for organizers. Sports began to move from informal gatherings to structured events that could attract thousands of paying attendees. The visibility gained from better transportation and communication also contributed to the rise and fall of certain sports during the 19th century. Some activities that had thrived locally could not adapt to the demands of larger audiences and standardized rules, leading them to fade into obscurity. Others, which may have been relatively minor pastimes, found themselves well suited to this new interconnected world and grew rapidly in popularity. For example, rowing benefited greatly from the ability to bring together crews from distant rivers and coasts for high-profile regattas. Similarly, emerging team sports like association football and rugby flourished as they could now organize national leagues and championships. Communication advances did not only affect scheduling and results reporting. The wider circulation of printed sporting manuals and illustrated guides allowed the techniques and strategies of games to spread much more quickly. A sport could develop a consistent style across vast regions, as players learned from the same source material, rather than relying on fragmented oral traditions. The sharing of written rules also made it easier for new clubs to form, since they could adopt the existing framework without inventing their own variations. The cultural perception of sports changed as well. In earlier times, games were often tied to local festivals or seasonal traditions, and their significance was deeply rooted in the identity of a particular community. With transportation and communication bringing sports into a larger arena, the emphasis shifted toward broader competition and achievement. Athletes became known beyond their hometowns, and some even achieved fame on a national scale. Newspapers began publishing player profiles, match previews, and opinion columns, cultivating a celebrity culture around certain figures. This had the effect of further attracting spectators, as fans were drawn not only to the sport itself, but also to the personalities who played it. Importantly, the influence of these technologies extended to forgotten sports as well. Some that disappeared from popular memory might have lasted longer had they been better able to adapt to the new pace of information exchange and travel. Others enjoyed brief revivals when revived by enthusiasts who used the telegraph or railway to organize exhibitions. In some cases, the very speed of change contributed to the decline of older games, as they were displaced by sports that could more easily fit into the regular schedules and standardized rules preferred by a national audience. The combination of fast travel and near-instant communication effectively created a competitive marketplace for sports, those that could appeal to a broad range of people, work within standardized formats, and generate consistent excitement tended to thrive. Those that relied heavily on local customs or seasonal availability often struggled to maintain relevance. By the late 19th century, transportation and communication had transformed the sporting landscape from a scattered collection of isolated activities into an interconnected web of events, clubs, and competitions. This shift paved the way for the rise of truly international sports in the 20th century, as the infrastructure for global competition was already being laid. The forgotten sports of the 19th century provide an interesting case study in how technological change can both elevate and erase traditions. While some of these games were swept aside by the rapid spread of more adaptable sports, their histories remain a testament to the cultural richness of the period. Understanding this dynamic also reveals that the story of sport is not only about the games themselves, but also about the ways in which society's broader systems of connection shape what people play, watch, and remember. The 19th century was defined by the sweeping changes brought on by industrialization, and these transformations had a profound effect on the way people spent their leisure time, including how sports were played, organized, and perceived. Before the rise of industrial economies, daily life for the majority of the population was dictated by agricultural rhythms. Work was tied to daylight and seasons, leaving only irregular periods for recreation. Sports and games were often tied to local festivals or harvest celebrations, and their occurrence was dependent on communal gatherings rather than structured schedules. With industrialization, this began to change. The shift from agrarian labor to factory work created a new structure in daily life. While the hours in early factories were long and exhausting, the eventual push for labor reforms in the mid to late 19th century led to shorter working days and, in some regions, the introduction of the Saturday half-day. This newfound regularity in free time allowed for the scheduling of recurring sporting events, which in turn encouraged the development of leagues, tournaments, and formal clubs. The rise of urban centres also contributed significantly to the evolution of sport. Industrial cities brought together large populations within concentrated areas, creating a critical mass of potential players and spectators. In rural areas, a game might attract only a handful of participants, but in a densely populated industrial town, organisers could draw on hundreds or even thousands of interested individuals. This concentration of people not only supported larger-scale events, but also fostered competition between neighbourhoods, workplaces, and cities, further stimulating the growth of organised sport. Industrialization also had a direct impact on the materials and equipment used in sports. The mass production capabilities of the era allowed for standardized, affordable gear. Balls, bats, rackets, and uniforms could be manufactured to consistent specifications and distributed widely. This uniformity helped ensure that games were played under similar conditions, making competitions fairer and more appealing to watch. In addition, advances in textile production allowed for the creation of specialized sports clothing, improving comfort and performance for athletes. The economic prosperity generated by industrialization, at least for some segments of society, also meant that more people could afford to spend money on leisure activities. Paid entry to events became commonplace, and the commercialization of sport began in earnest. Entrepreneurs recognized that well-organized competitions could draw paying crowds, and they invested in facilities, promotions, and player recruitment. Some sports began offering financial incentives to top players, marking the early stages of professionalism. This shift was not without controversy, as some traditionalists argued that monetary rewards corrupted the spirit of amateur competition. But the trend toward professionalism proved unstoppable in many popular sports. Industrialization also influenced the physical infrastructure of sport. Factories, railways, and urban development projects often consumed open spaces that had previously been used informally for games, which might have contributed to the decline of some traditional rural sports. However, this loss of informal playing grounds was offset by the construction of purpose-built facilities such as stadiums, gymnasiums, and indoor arenas. These new venues made it possible to hold events regardless of weather and to accommodate much larger audiences than ever before. The growing accessibility of such facilities helped some sports transition from seasonal or occasional pastimes into year-round pursuits. Another important factor was the cultural shift brought about by industrial society's emphasis on discipline, punctuality, and organization. The values required in the workplace began to influence leisure as well. Sports that could be played according to strict schedules and clear rules fit neatly into this industrial mindset. Timed halves, regulated breaks, and standardized field dimensions reflected the precision and structure of the new industrial order. As a result, sports with adaptable, casual formats sometimes struggled to find a place in this environment, while those that could be easily codified thrived. The link between industry and sport was also visible in the workplace itself. Many factories and companies formed their own teams, seeing organized sports as a way to build camaraderie among workers, promote loyalty to the employer, and encourage physical fitness. These workplace teams often competed in inter-company leagues, which not only provided entertainment, but also reinforced social hierarchies and networks within industrial communities. The connection between industrial labor and sports was not always harmonious, however. The physical demands of factory work could leave workers too exhausted to participate fully in strenuous games, and in some cases, injuries sustained during recreational play could impact a worker's ability to earn a living. Employers sometimes restricted or discouraged certain sports they considered too dangerous, favoring safer activities that would not result in lost productivity. Despite these challenges, industrialization ultimately expanded the possibilities for organized sport. The combination of increased leisure time, larger urban populations, standardized equipment, commercial investment, and purpose-built venues created fertile ground for the rise of many sports that continue to be played today. At the same time, these changes contributed to the fading of some older games that could not adapt to the new realities of urban industrial life. The forgotten sports of the 19th century often represent the last remnants of a pre-industrial leisure culture, rooted in local traditions and informal gatherings. They serve as reminders that the history of sport is deeply intertwined with the history of work, technology, and social organization. In understanding how industrialization shaped leisure, one can better appreciate why some sports rose to prominence while others faded quietly into obscurity. The story is not merely one of games lost and gained, but of a society in transition, redefining the very concept of recreation in an age of machines, schedules, and rapidly changing ways of life. The rapid advancements in transportation and communication during the 19th century played a transformative role in the spread, organization, and popularity of sports. marking a decisive shift from localized, small-scale games to regional, national, and even international competitions. Before the expansion of railways and telegraph networks, most sports were confined to the immediate vicinity of where they originated. Travel was slow, often limited to what could be accomplished on foot or by horse, and the dissemination of information relied on word of mouth or printed notices in local newspapers that reached a limited audience. This geographical isolation meant that each community often had its own variations of rules, its own unique traditions, and limited opportunities to compete against distant rivals. The introduction of the railway network fundamentally altered this landscape. Trains allowed teams, athletes, and spectators to travel far greater distances in a fraction of the time it had once taken. A match that previously might have required several days of travel could now be reached in hours, enabling clubs to arrange fixtures with opponents from other towns or cities on a regular basis. This increased mobility not only expanded the pool of competitors, but also encouraged the standardization of rules, as it became necessary to ensure fair play between teams from different regions. Railways also made it possible for large numbers of fans to attend events far from their homes, boosting gate receipts and fostering a growing culture of dedicated supporters. The telegraph was equally revolutionary in the way it connected sporting communities. Results of matches, once known only locally, could now be transmitted almost instantly to newspapers hundreds of miles away, allowing readers to follow the progress of leagues and tournaments they could not physically attend. This created a sense of shared engagement across wide areas and helped transform certain sports into national talking points. The speed of communication also facilitated more efficient scheduling, with last-minute arrangements or changes now feasible in a way they had never been before. These developments in transport and communication were mutually reinforcing. The ability to quickly spread news of an upcoming event encouraged more spectators to make the journey, while improved transportation ensured they could do so with relative ease. As a result, sports began to take on a new role as both a form of entertainment and a commercial enterprise. Promoters and organizers could plan larger events with confidence that they could attract both participants and paying audiences from well beyond the immediate locality. This combination of wider reach and growing commercial potential contributed significantly to the emergence of professional sports, as the revenues generated by large crowds and extensive media coverage allowed players to be compensated for their time and skill. Transportation also influenced the types of sports that flourished. Activities that could be played in large, central venues, such as cricket grounds or football pitches, benefited enormously from the influx of travelling spectators, while more localized, rural games without dedicated facilities struggled to maintain their appeal in an era when grand spectacles drew attention and resources. The centralization of major events in urban or accessible locations meant that some traditional sports of isolated regions began to decline, unable to compete with the scale and excitement of these larger gatherings. Communication technology not only spread information, but also began to shape the culture of sport. Newspapers dedicated entire sections to reporting on matches, analysing tactics, and debating the merits of different players. This growing body of sports journalism elevated athletes to the status of public figures, their exploits discussed and dissected far beyond the places where they performed. Fans could develop loyalties to teams they had never seen in person, purely through the stories and statistics they read. In this way, transportation and communication worked together to build the foundations of modern sports fandom, transforming what had once been local pastimes into shared cultural experiences that transcended geography. The role of the postal system should not be overlooked either. Though slower than the telegraph, reliable mail delivery allowed for the exchange of detailed rulebooks, club charters, and other organizational documents between distant teams. This contributed to the gradual harmonization of rules and practices, reducing the confusion and disputes that could arise when different interpretations of a game came into contact. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the combination of faster travel and quicker communication had made possible the establishment of national governing bodies for many sports. These organizations formalized competition structures, enforced standardized rules, and oversaw the growth of their respective games on a scale that would have been unimaginable only a few generations earlier. They also facilitated the first truly international competitions, as athletes and teams could now cross borders with relative ease, and their performances could be followed by audiences around the world. Yet this progress also brought changes that altered the character of sport in ways not everyone welcomed. The emphasis on large-scale events and national prestige sometimes overshadowed the community-based spirit that had long defined local games. Traditional, informal sports that lacked the infrastructure or broad appeal to take advantage of these new systems gradually disappeared from public consciousness, surviving only in scattered records or in the memories of older generations. The forgotten sports of the 19th century often belong to this category, victims of a new world in which speed, connectivity, and spectacle reigned supreme. Nevertheless, the influence of transportation and communication in this period cannot be overstated. They created the conditions for sport to grow beyond its local roots, enabling the emergence of the modern sporting world with its vast audiences, organized competitions, and global reach. Without these innovations, many of the games we take for granted today might never have evolved into the structured, widely celebrated activities they are now. The 19th century thus stands as the moment when sport, like so many other aspects of human society, was drawn into the accelerating currents of a connected, industrializing world. In the 19th century, social class exerted a profound influence on who participated in sports, the types of games played, and the manner in which they were organized and experienced. The division between the upper, middle, and working classes was sharply defined in most industrialized nations, and sport both reflected and reinforced these distinctions. Among the upper classes, sports were often associated with leisure, refinement, and the cultivation of personal character. Activities such as cricket, fox hunting, rowing, and tennis were pursued not only for enjoyment, but also as demonstrations of social status. Membership in exclusive clubs and access to well-maintained private grounds ensured that these pursuits remained out of reach for the majority of the population. The rules, etiquette, and traditions surrounding these sports emphasized gentlemanly conduct and fair play, with an emphasis on amateurism as a mark of moral superiority. Earning money from sport was generally frowned upon in upper-class circles, as it was believed to degrade the spirit of competition by introducing commercial incentives. For the emerging middle classes, sports played a slightly different role, as industrialization created new wealth and opportunities for social mobility. Middle-class professionals began to adopt certain upper-class leisure activities, often with a greater focus on organization and efficiency. They founded clubs, codified rules, and arranged formal competitions, sometimes bridging the gap between purely aristocratic pastimes and the more accessible games of the working class. Sports such as cycling, athletics, and association football began to attract participants from this group, particularly as urban infrastructure improved and recreational spaces became more common. The working classes, in contrast, had historically relied on informal, community-based games that required minimal equipment and were often played in open spaces, streets, or fields. These included forms of street football, wrestling, and various local traditions that varied from one region to another. The limited leisure time available to workers, often restricted to Sunday afternoons or occasional public holidays, shaped the nature of their participation. As industrial reform and labour movements gradually reduced working hours, opportunities for regular involvement in sport increased, leading to the growth of organised working-class teams, especially in football and rugby. In many industrial towns, factory owners and community leaders recognised the potential of sport as a means of fostering discipline, loyalty, and unity among workers. Some employers sponsored teams, provided playing fields, or encouraged participation as a way to promote healthy lifestyles and reduce social unrest. This support sometimes came with an expectation of adherence to particular moral codes, reflecting the broader Victorian emphasis on self-improvement and respectability. The intersection of class and sport also played out in the debates over professionalism. While upper-class sportsmen tended to cling to amateur ideals, working-class athletes often welcomed the possibility of being paid for their skills, seeing it as a legitimate way to earn a livelihood. This divergence led to tensions in sports governance, with some organisations instituting strict rules to exclude professionals or limit their participation. Over time, however, the financial realities of attracting talented players and large audiences eroded the barriers to professionalism, especially in sports with mass appeal. Class distinctions could also be seen in the facilities and resources available to athletes. Wealthier participants had access to purpose-built venues, quality equipment, and coaching, while working-class players often had to make do with rough fields, improvised gear, and self-taught techniques. This disparity influenced not only the style of play, but also the opportunities for advancement. Talented individuals from humble backgrounds sometimes faced considerable obstacles in gaining recognition or being accepted into elite competitions. Spectatorship, too, was shaped by class. Wealthy patrons might enjoy sports from private boxes or members' enclosures, while working-class fans crowded into standing terraces or watched from nearby hillsides without paying admission. The behaviour expected in these different settings varied, with upper-class audiences encouraged to remain composed and restrained, and working-class crowds developing a more vocal and passionate style of support. This contrast contributed to the evolving culture of fandom, as the raucous enthusiasm of mass audiences became a defining feature of certain sports. In rural areas, traditional games often served as important community events that brought together people across class lines, although even here, differences could be observed in the roles individuals played. Landowners might sponsor events or act as judges, while tenants and labourers participated as competitors or provided manual assistance in setting up the grounds. The industrialisation and urbanisation of the century increasingly pulled these traditions into a more commercial and organised framework, but remnants of older, class-blended festivities persisted in some regions. Ultimately, the role of social class in 19th century sports was complex, influencing everything from the rules and structures of games to the opportunities available for participation and the ways in which events were experienced. While the century witnessed significant progress in making sport accessible to a wider segment of the population, deep-rooted inequalities remained. These class-based patterns of access, behavior, and prestige would continue to shape the sporting landscape well into the 20th century, leaving a legacy that can still be traced in the organization and culture of many sports today. The 19th century was a period of dramatic transformation in many aspects of society, and industrialization played a central role in reshaping the nature and organization of sports. As factories, railways, and urban centers expanded, they brought new patterns of work, leisure, and social interaction that fundamentally altered how people engaged with athletic activities. One of the most significant changes brought about by industrialization was the reorganization of time. In pre-industrial societies, sport was often tied to seasonal rhythms, festivals, or local traditions, with no strict distinction between work and play. The industrial work schedule, with its rigid hours and limited days off, changed this dynamic. While the long hours of early industrial labor initially restricted opportunities for sport, the gradual introduction of the Saturday half-holiday and other labor reforms created regular periods of free time. This newfound predictability allowed people to plan and participate in scheduled matches, giving rise to organized leagues and formal competitions. The growth of railways and improvements in transportation were equally transformative. In earlier times, most sports were local affairs, with teams competing only against nearby communities due to the difficulty of travel. Railways made it possible for teams to travel to distant towns and cities, fostering inter-regional competition and broadening the popularity of various games. Spectators, too, could now travel to watch important matches, contributing to the growth of fan culture and larger event attendance. Urbanization also had a profound influence on the development of sports. As people moved from rural areas to crowded industrial cities, the available spaces for recreation changed. Large open fields became scarce, prompting the adaptation of certain sports to smaller venues or the construction of purpose-built facilities. Urban parks, gymnasiums, and stadiums began to appear, often supported by local authorities or private investors who saw value in promoting physical activity and social order. This shift toward formal, enclosed spaces helped standardize playing conditions and facilitated the collection of admission fees, making sports a viable commercial enterprise. Industrialization also fostered the rise of mass media, which played a key role in spreading interest in sports. The printing press, now more efficient and affordable, enabled newspapers to publish regular sports sections, complete with match reports, player profiles, and league tables. This not only kept local communities informed, but also connected distant fans to the outcomes of competitions far from their own towns. The ability to follow teams and athletes through the press helped cultivate loyal fan bases and increase the prestige of major events. Another significant effect of industrialization was the shift toward professionalization in many sports. As working-class athletes demonstrated exceptional skill, there was growing demand to see them compete regularly. However, the need for these players to earn a living meant that compensation became a practical necessity. While this clashed with the amateur ideals upheld by many upper-class sporting bodies, the commercial success of paying players could not be ignored. Over time, professional leagues emerged in football, cricket, and other sports, transforming them into full-time careers for talented individuals. Advances in manufacturing and industry also improved the quality and accessibility of sporting equipment. Standardized production meant that balls, bats, rackets, and uniforms could be made more consistently and sold at prices affordable to a broader segment of society. This not only enhanced the quality of play, but also encouraged wider participation, as more people could obtain the tools needed to join in organized games. Industrial wealth also allowed certain patrons to invest heavily in sports infrastructure. Businessmen and industrialists sponsored teams, built stadiums, and provided facilities for their workers, seeing this as a means to promote loyalty, discipline, and community spirit. In some cases, these investments had a philanthropic motive, aimed at improving the health and morale of the working classes. In others, they were calculated efforts to associate a company's name with popular local teams and events. The competitive spirit, encouraged by industrial society itself, may have also influenced the evolution of sports. The emphasis on productivity, efficiency, and measurable achievement paralleled the development of codified rules, official governing bodies, and standardized scoring systems in sport. Just as factories valued precision and consistency, so too did sports begin to demand formal regulations to ensure fairness and comparability across competitions. Industrialization further encouraged the diversification of sports, with more people living in urban centers and seeking structured leisure activities. New sports were invented or imported from other regions. Some, like association football, adapted traditional folk games into more organized forms. Others, such as lawn tennis and modern athletics, were innovations that took advantage of new facilities and social trends. Over time, these sports spread beyond their country of origin, aided by industrial-era networks of trade, travel, and communication. In the broader sense, industrialization not only provided the material conditions for the expansion of sport, but also helped shape the cultural values associated with it. Concepts like teamwork, discipline, punctuality, and meritocracy mirrored the ideals promoted in industrial workplaces, making sports an extension of the same social order. By the close of the 19th century, the impact of industrialization on sports was unmistakable. What had once been largely local, informal, and seasonal activities had evolved into structured, widely followed, and often professionalized institutions. The legacy of these changes remains deeply embedded in the sporting world of today, from the standardized rules and schedules to the global networks of competition and fandom that continue to grow. The transition from traditional games to modern sports in the 19th century was a gradual yet profound transformation that reshaped leisure, competition, and social interaction. Traditional games, often rooted in local customs, seasonal festivities, and informal community gatherings, had long provided a form of recreation for people across rural and urban settings. These games were typically passed down orally, with rules that varied from one village to another, allowing for a flexible and adaptable approach to play. However, as society became more interconnected through industrialization, urbanization, and advances in communication, the need for standardized and organized forms of sport began to emerge. One of the main drivers of this transition was the codification of rules. In the past, disputes during a game might be settled by local consensus or the authority of respected community members, but with the expansion of competition beyond local boundaries, it became essential to have universally accepted regulations. This led to the establishment of governing bodies and written rulebooks for sports such as football, cricket, and rugby. Codification ensured that a match played in one region would follow the same standards as a match played hundreds of miles away, thereby fostering fair competition and enabling the creation of formal leagues and tournaments. The influence of public schools in Britain was particularly significant in this shift. Institutions like Eton, Harrow, and Rugby began to integrate organised sports into their educational philosophy, viewing them as a means of instilling discipline, teamwork, and moral character in students. Many modern sports took shape within these environments, where young men refined the rules, emphasized fair play, and spread the games to universities and later to the broader public. When these students graduated, they carried the sports with them into military service, colonial administration, and professional life, helping to popularize them both domestically and internationally. Urbanization also played a key role in this transformation. As populations concentrated in growing industrial cities, traditional rural pastimes became less practical due to limited space and changing lifestyles. In their place, purpose-built facilities such as gymnasiums, swimming baths, and enclosed pitches allowed modern sports to flourish. These venues not only standardized the playing environment, but also made it possible to charge admission, turning sports into commercial entertainment and creating a market for professional athletes. Another aspect of this transition was the increasing emphasis on competitive structure. Traditional games often prioritized participation and community bonding over the outcome. But modern sports placed greater focus on winning, records, and measurable achievement. This was reinforced by the introduction of leagues, knockout tournaments, and official championships, all of which provided regular opportunities for spectators to follow and support their teams. The rise of spectator culture, in turn, encouraged further investment in facilities, equipment, and promotion. Technological advancements also contributed to the evolution of sports. The printing press, now operating at greater speed and lower cost, allowed newspapers to report on matches, publish league tables, and profile athletes, helping to spread interest beyond the immediate locality of the event. The telegraph made it possible for results to be transmitted quickly, enhancing the excitement and immediacy of sports coverage. Improved manufacturing techniques provided players with better and more standardized equipment, which not only improved the quality of play, but also ensured fairness by reducing discrepancies caused by makeshift gear. The social dimension of this shift should not be underestimated. Modern sports became an avenue for social mobility, particularly for talented individuals from working-class backgrounds who could earn recognition and sometimes a living from their abilities. This stood in contrast to many traditional games, which were often limited in scope and visibility. At the same time, some segments of society resisted the move toward professionalism, arguing that sport should remain a pastime pursued for its own sake rather than for monetary gain. This tension between amateurism and professionalism shaped the policies of many early sports organizations and continues to influence the culture of sport today. International influences also began to shape modern sports during this period. Colonial expansion and increased global trade facilitated the spread of codified games to distant parts of the world, where they often replaced or coexisted with local traditional games. British sports such as cricket, football, and rugby took root in countries across the Commonwealth, while American innovations like baseball began to gain international followings. This global dissemination further reinforced the need for standardized rules and governing bodies capable of managing international competition. By the late 19th century, the transformation was nearly complete. Traditional games had not entirely disappeared. Many continued in rural areas or as part of cultural festivals. But they were overshadowed by the organized, rule-bound, and commercially viable sports that dominated urban and national life. The foundations laid in this era set the stage for the 20th century's explosion of international sporting events, from the revival of the Olympic Games to the creation of professional leagues that captured global audiences. The shift from traditional games to modern sports was not merely a change in recreational activity. It reflected deeper societal changes, including the move toward industrial discipline, the rise of mass communication, and the increasing value placed on measurable performance. It marked the beginning of sport as we recognize it today, an institution woven into the cultural, economic, and political fabric of the modern world. The late 19th century and the dawn of the 20th century witnessed a significant reshaping of the sporting landscape, as some sports that had once enjoyed widespread popularity gradually faded from the public consciousness, while others rose to prominence and cemented their place in modern culture. This process was driven by a complex interplay of social change, technological development, shifting leisure patterns, and evolving public tastes, and it reflected broader transformations in society itself. Many of the sports that declined during this period were deeply rooted in specific regional or rural traditions. Games like stool ball, mob football, or pedestrianism thrived in earlier times when local customs, agricultural schedules, and communal gatherings formed the backbone of leisure activity. However, as industrialization and urbanization redefined daily life, these games often struggled to adapt to the more regulated rhythms of the city, where open spaces were limited and where recreation increasingly demanded organized schedules, standardized rules, and a degree of commercial viability. The absence of codified regulations was a major reason some sports lost traction. In an age where newspapers, sporting clubs, and governing bodies began to promote competition on a national and international scale, sports that could not be easily standardized faced difficulty attracting consistent audiences or participants. Pedestrianism, for example, once one of the most popular spectator sports in the English-speaking world, suffered from the rise of track and field athletics, with formalized events and recognized distances. Similarly, traditional forms of wrestling or local ball games often gave way to more organized and heavily promoted alternatives that could be more easily integrated into school programs, military training, and public competitions. Another factor in the decline of certain sports was the changing moral and social climate. Some games, particularly those with rough physical contact or chaotic, unregulated play, were criticized for being dangerous, unruly, or morally questionable. Authorities in industrial cities, seeking to impose order and respectability on working-class leisure, often encouraged the adoption of sports like football, cricket, and rowing, which were perceived as more disciplined and character-building. This moral framing made it easier for such sports to gain institutional support, further marginalizing older pastimes that lacked such endorsement. The rise of other sports during the same period was closely linked to their ability to adapt to these new social and economic realities. Football, for instance, benefited enormously from the establishment of clear rules, league structures, and accessible playing fields, making it easy to organize and follow. Cricket maintained its status by combining its long tradition with the ability to attract large crowds in purpose-built venues, while also benefiting from its role in fostering imperial identity across the British Empire. In the United States, baseball emerged as the national pastime, offering an urban-friendly alternative to rural games and quickly evolving into a professional sport with organised leagues and star players who became national figures. The role of media in shaping the fortunes of sports cannot be overstated. Sports that could be easily covered in newspapers, with clear scores and notable moments, were more likely to thrive in an age when mass communication was becoming a dominant force. The Telegraph allowed instant reporting of match results, and the expansion of illustrated publications meant that sports with visually striking moments could captivate audiences far from the venues where they were played. Sports that lacked this clarity or visual appeal often faded in relevance. International competition also played a crucial role in determining which sports would rise and which would decline. Sports with the ability to foster national pride and be contested on a global stage naturally attracted more investment, both financial and cultural. The revival of the Olympic Games in 1896 was a turning point, offering a prestigious platform for codified sports and pushing many older, localized games further to the margins. In some cases, declining sports did not disappear entirely, but instead transformed or merged into newer forms. Traditional wrestling styles often became part of standardized amateur wrestling. Local stick and ball games influenced the rules and play styles of modern hockey or lacrosse, and folk running events contributed to the codification of track races. This blending of old and new allowed some elements of pastimes to survive, even as their original forms were replaced. The rise of professionalism in sport further accelerated the shift. Sports that could attract paying spectators, secure sponsorship, and maintain regular seasons quickly outcompeted those that remained purely amateur or irregular in scheduling. The growing appetite for organized entertainment in an increasingly urbanized and industrialized world meant that the most successful sports were those that could deliver predictable, exciting, and marketable experiences on a regular basis. By the early 20th century, the winners of this evolutionary process were clear. Football, cricket, rugby, baseball, and other codified, spectator-friendly sports had established themselves as dominant forces, supported by strong institutional structures and growing fan communities. Meanwhile, many of the forgotten sports of the 19th century became historical curiosities, preserved in local festivals, revived in heritage events, or remembered only in old newspaper archives and the memories of those who had once played them. This transformation was not simply a matter of taste, but a reflection of the broader shift toward modernity. The rise and fall of different sports mirrored the industrialization of leisure, the globalization of culture, and the growing influence of media and commerce on everyday life. What was lost in the process was a certain local colour and diversity of play, but what was gained was a shared sporting language that could unite people across cities, countries, and even continents. In the end, the decline of certain sports and the rise of others was part of a larger story, the transformation of recreation from a local, irregular pastime into a central, organised, and celebrated element of modern society.